So thanks everyone for joining us for this webinar on resilient cooling in homes. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm coming to you from today, which is the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and I encourage everyone who's attending this webinar to share the lands on which you're dialing in from today in the chat, if that's something you'd like to do. My name is Julianne Tice. I am a Buildings Policy Advisor at the Energy Efficiency Council, and I'll be your host for the next hour and a half. For anyone who's not familiar with the Energy Efficiency Council, we are Australia's peak body for smart energy management and demand response. So it's a pretty natural crossover for us to be hosting this webinar on resilience in homes, especially. So when I think of a resilient home, I think of one that, of course, protects its occupants from the impacts of climate change, whether that's heat stress or flooding or other climate impacts. And when I think of an energy efficient house, I think of one that is adequately heated or adequately insulated and sealed, and that also protects its occupants from heat stress and other climate impacts. So really an energy efficient home is a resilient home and vice versa. So this webinar is also quite timely to be talking about resilience. So we've obviously been having quite a bit of flooding in the southeast of Australia. And we've had, or we're coming up on bushfire season now, although remains to be seen whether that will be an issue with La Nina, hopefully not. But of course, we have had quite severe bushfire impacts in the past few years and in the past few decades. And we've, of course, been seeing quite a lot of devastation in these communities that have been dealing with the flooding and the bushfires. So I think it's a pretty good reminder that when we talk about these impacts, we're no longer talking about future impacts. Really, we're talking about the impacts of climate change right now. And we also need to talk about, the future impacts that will be probably even worse than what we're experiencing right now, which is quite a sobering thought, really. And another reminder that we're getting about all of this is the CSIRO and Bureau of Meteorology's report that was released yesterday on the State of the Climate 2022, which showed that we are seeing an increase in extreme heat events and longer fire seasons. So it's not something that we're imagining. It really is, it's really happening, and we're experiencing, climate impacts now. So we need to start thinking a lot about resilience and how we're going to adapt to these impacts now and into the future, because we are definitely not seeing the end of it. So we're talking specifically about heat stress today and heat stress in homes. So we're not talking so much about flooding, but of course, all of that is connected. But I'm really excited to say, on a slightly lighter note, that I have a really exciting lineup of speakers to talk about this topic with me today. So I think it will be a really interesting conversation. I'll let those speakers introduce themselves in just a minute, but just wanted to give also some background on why we are doing this webinar. So the Energy Efficiency Council is supported by the Australian government to support or to facilitate Australia's engagement with the International Energy Agency's Energy in Buildings and Communities Technology Collaboration Program. It's quite a mouthful, but we call it the IEA-EBC for short, and that's a global research collaboration on different research topics within energy and buildings. And so there's one research stream, or Annex in particular, called Annex 80, Resilient Cooling in Buildings, and we wanted to highlight the work of that Annex, and we have one of the speakers from that Annex, Wendy Miller, with us today. I'll get her to introduce herself in just a minute, not quite yet. But the reason that we're doing this webinar is to highlight the work of that research stream. And I thought that presented a really great opportunity to get some other speakers in who are doing this work on the ground in Australia. And so I think it's a really great opportunity to talk about the international movements in this space, but also to talk about the work that's happening at the community level and at the individual household level in terms of resilience and heat stress. And of course, it's really important to remember when we're talking about resilience in homes that it's the most vulnerable members of our society who are feeling these impacts the most. So those tend to be people on low incomes who might have capacity to cool their house to the degree that they would like to, or people who rent their homes who might not be able to make those changes that they would like to improve their house, and older people who are more vulnerable to those impacts. So again, I will let the speakers that we have today introduce themselves in just a minute, but just to talk about what we're going to do for the next hour and a half or so, we're going to be deviating from the normal kind of webinar format just slightly so that we don't kill you with PowerPoints. We're actually just going to do about a 90-minute panel discussion. So I'll have our speakers introduce themselves and their work, and then we'll go straight into a panel discussion. So I'll ask our speakers some questions, but as soon as you have any questions that you would like to ask, feel free to drop them into the Q&A, and hopefully we can get to as many of those as possible. So really looking forward to this discussion. And one final bit of housekeeping, we will be recording the webinar, so if you do need to leave early, or if you had any colleagues who couldn't make it today, we'll be sending that out to, next week to everyone. And also finally wanted to thank the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water for supporting this webinar and supporting the EEC to facilitate Australia's engagement in the IEA EBC program more broadly. So with that, we will get to the introductions of our speakers. So first we have Wendy Miller, who is the Australian representative on the IEA EBC's Annex 80 on resilient cooling in buildings. So I will ask Wendy to just come on screen. So Wendy, if you could tell us about that research program and your various roles, both within IEA EBC and outside of it, that would be fantastic.
Great, thanks, Julianne. So I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Science at Queensland University of Technology, and the annex that I'm involved in, resilient cooling, consists of representatives from 25 countries, and it's been meeting since 2018, but its official operating period is from 2019 to 2023. So the aim of any of these working groups under the International Energy Agency is to identify a challenge that many nations have and to work on collaborative solutions. So this particular annex was established to address the rapid increase in air conditioning in buildings, which is driven by a range of factors such as urbanisation, climate change, changes to comfort expectations, and economic growth and building growth in hotter climates or the developing countries of the world. But in turn, reliance on air conditioning can add to greenhouse gas emissions and make the climate problem worse. It can impact on electricity grids, contribute to urban heat, and present affordability and equity challenges. So the Annex, this work program, is developing, assessing and communicating solutions of resilient cooling and overheating protection in buildings, particularly in housing, but not only in housing. So it is aiming to address the issue of overheating from 4 perspectives. The first is to how can we reduce heat entry into buildings? So that's essentially an issue of design and material selection. Then how can we remove heat and humidity from the building? And lastly, what are some options for enhancing the comfort of individual people as opposed to cooling a whole space? So there are 4 different approaches. And each of those 4 approaches were broken down then into, or tackled in various ways through 4 subtasks. And participants of the work program can opt to be involved in a single or multiple subtasks depending on their expertise and availability, their specific country's focus, and whatever funding and support they've been able to garner from various sources. So the majority of participants are members of research organisations, not just universities, but also national organisations like CSIRO, NREL, etc. And organisationally, 2 expert meetings are held each year where all the participants share and discuss their relative tasks collectively. There are quarterly subtask leaders meetings to plan each 6-monthly period, and then each subtask meets regularly with their own smaller group, and everybody works independently as well. So there's a lot of peer and expert review of the work that goes on. So I'm a joint leader of the fundamentals subtask, where our first job was to define what resilience means. And my co-leader addressed this from an engineering technical perspective.
The capacity to recover quickly from
But I
difficult
approached this by examining a wide range of disciplines, strategies, and disaster risk management processes. So for me, this was instrumental in broadening the group's approach to and concept of resilience. So for me, resilience is not just designing a technology that won't fail or a technology that can quickly recover after an adverse event. It's much more complex than that and involves consideration of the resilience of individuals and populations. So their physical, psychological, and economic resilience, the resilience of buildings, so the urban context in which they're situated, of the technologies that provide cooling, and of the energy system on which these technologies rely to provide us with cooling. So other work in this subtask also involved identifying and developing methods and tools that globally we can use for predicting the capacity and performance of a wide range of cooling system types. So not just the typical air conditioners we have in Australia, for example. This includes, for example, the development of future climate files for a typical year and a heat wave event stretching out to 100 years into the future, for being able to use in building simulation to test the likely benefits of such technologies. Then another task group, the solutions task group, has been using the definitions and tools to assess the benefits, the limitations, and the performance indicators of resilient cooling solutions. So one of the key outputs of the Annex led by this group will be a set of technology profiles that summarise the operational characteristics, the benefits and the limitations of different technologies or different approaches for different climates and for different types of buildings and different cultural contexts. The third task group collates evaluations of field studies, so measurements from real buildings that are using some of these technologies already, and reports on issues such as differences between the predicted and the actual performance, how people have interacted with the building and the technologies, and the effectiveness and usability of any control strategies. The fourth task group, and one that I'm currently participating in as well, is collating and analysing policies, regulations, labelling programs and standards relating to resilient cooling. So the intent is to identify where effective policies and regulations already exist, pardon me, and could be replicated, and where new policies or regulations need to be designed and implemented. For example, Australia in our residential building codes already has some good policies regarding how ceiling fans can help provide a good level of indoor comfort without the energy impacts of an air conditioning system. But ceiling fans are not included in a lot of other countries' building regulations. On the other hand, whilst we have fans in our building codes for houses, we don't have any product rating methodology for those fans on, their energy efficiency, how much air they move, how noisy they are, etc. But the US does have a good rating program for fans. So just being able to identify that gives some indication of perhaps something Australia could adopt from the US in terms of rating fans, and something that European standards, for example, could adopt regarding including fans in building regulations. So this work is approaching completion, and we expect to be able to host an Australian specific discussion about this output on the policy recommendations in the new year. I must admit to being initially overwhelmed by the depth and breadth of the expertise of being that comes together at these meetings and being involved in this annex. Perhaps a bit of imposter syndrome in a sense, as I'm the only socio-technical participant among a field of building physicists and engineers and architects. But the collaboration has expanded my skill sets and my broader outlook has, I think, expanded the group's perspective and approach. So it's inspiring and motivating to be involved with many people from diverse cultural and technical backgrounds, trying to address resilience in our built environment. Thanks, Julianne.
Thanks, Wendy. And we spoke a bit about this earlier, but I think it's really interesting and important to have that social perspective, I suppose, in that annex, along with all of the other technical people, because while it's really important to talk about the technical side of things, it really is meaningless if we're not connecting it to the people who are actually going to be impacted by these technologies and climate impacts. So thanks for that, Wendy. Next, we have Kelly G, who joins us from the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils, or WSROC. And WSROC has been doing some really interesting work under the Turn Down the Heat strategy. So I'll let Kelly talk about that. But Kelly, if you'd like to talk about that strategy and your role at WSROC, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Julianne. Yeah, as Julianne mentioned, I'm a project and policy officer at WSROC. We're a membership organisation representing local government in Western Sydney. So that's essentially from between Parramatta and the Blue Mountains. Our role really is to work on projects at a regional scale that our member councils see areas of common interest. So we do a lot of work in energy efficiency and sustainability. We work on issues around waste management, circular economy, but heat has definitely emerged as one of the really key areas for our organisation and for the region as a whole. A few years ago, I think it was 2020, Penrith in Western Sydney was all over the news as the hottest place in the world. It reached 48.9 degrees in that summer. And while I know there are a lot of other places in Australia that get a lot hotter than that, I think the density of population and the infrastructure in that area of Sydney really elevates kind of the risks that communities are facing. So heat was identified by our councils. They were seeing the impacts that heat was having for their communities in all types of different ways at the local scale. But I guess it quickly became apparent to them that this wasn't something that could be addressed on an LGA by LGA basis or even by local government alone. So the Turn Down the Heat strategy was developed by WSROC and its councils in partnership with around 55 different organisations from across Western Sydney, from state government, community sector, academics, universities, and infrastructure providers and developers to look at what we should be doing in our region to improve resilience to heat. The strategy outlines 5 kind of areas for action. One is taking action together. One's around planning to cool the built environment, urban planning. Another is around green and blue infrastructure. A third is a community that's healthy and prepared, and that really goes to ensuring people are aware of risks, they're educated, they know how to manage their risks and know how to respond in emergency events. And the last one is innovative and responsive infrastructure, because we do know that in these big scale heat events, infrastructure is really significantly impacted. So in terms of Turn Down the Heat, I think firstly, it's important to note that the purpose of our strategy was really to raise awareness about the issue, to bring people together and provide a kind of a guiding document to coordinate action. We have been working on the strategy's delivery since over the past 5 years, thanks to grant funding from various sources, but ultimately a lot of the actions in there don't fall to WSROC, but we are working in partnership with a lot of other organisations to try and get action moving in this space across the region. So in terms of our work, because we do represent local government, we really have been focused in that urban planning and that community preparedness space, because that's kind of the wheelhouse of local government. And a few of the projects we're looking at over the past 5 years look at developing guidance for councils to integrate urban heat island mitigation into their planning instruments, because that really is a new area for planning and needed quite a bit of work to translate that science into planning guidance. We've also developed, building on that work, some broader recommendations and a cool suburbs urban heat resilience tool for broader industry and state government as well. We've been working with research partners and councils to trial different tree species and passive irrigation systems to look at how, the trees that we are planting across our city will perform under future climates and in the streetscape. And then we've also done a bit of research recently looking at how our current rating systems around thermal comfort are performing. So in New South Wales, that's the basics tool, but that takes in, shortly that will be aligned with the NATHA's rating for people who are coming in from other areas of Australia. And finally, we've looked quite closely and consulted with a lot of different organisations around the governance of heat waves in Western Sydney, and particularly that sort of covers, I guess, broader Greater Sydney and New South Wales as well. So in New South Wales at the moment, some of the planning and preparedness for heat waves as disaster or natural hazard events isn't as progressed as some of, say, our fire and flood and our other hazards that are a bit more mature. So we've been working over the past few years to really look at how we can be improving those processes and in terms of the governance, but also as a secondary part of that, we've been working with communities and community service providers and our local health districts to develop materials and community education tools to ensure that communities are more prepared and aware of their heatwave risks. And I think that's enough to start with from me.
Great, thanks so much, Kelly. It seems like a theme of collaboration is kind of emerging just from the work that both you and Wendy are doing or involved with. So it's really great that all of these different LGAs are working together because obviously, as you say, this is an issue that is affecting lots of people across lots of different areas. So working together is really the way to come to some solutions around that. So thanks, Kelly. I'll go to Ben last, but certainly not least. So Ben joins us, Ben Latham joins us from the Victorian Council of Social Service, or VCOS, which released the Feeling the Heat report last May. So Ben, if you could tell us about that report and your role at VCOS and VCOS's work on resilience more broadly, that would be great. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, sure thing. And thanks so much for inviting me along today. So as mentioned, I work at the Victorian Council of Social Service, or VCOS. Every state and territory has a COS as well as the national group, ACOS. So in Victoria, we represent the community sector. That's not-for-profits like disability advocates, family violence services, community legal centres, organisations like that. Then we also do a lot of policy research and advocacy around poverty and disadvantage in Victoria. So my role at VCOS is researching climate change or climate equity, climate justice. And we really approach that massive issue of climate change through that equity lens, realizing that climate change affects people experiencing disadvantage the most, while people experiencing disadvantage benefit the least from the transition to zero emissions, things like solar panels and electric vehicles, for example. And when we talk to community service organisations about climate change, extreme heat was by far the most common thing that came up. I think an element of that was the fact that we see extreme heat year in and year out. Organisations themselves are affected, including staff members and their services. And they also do a lot of work with their clients about preparing for extreme heat. So they see those impacts every year. So that led us to the Feeling the Heat report that was mentioned just before. Basically what we did is we wanted to break down heat vulnerability. So we looked at, I think, 9 different demographic factors and then had to think about how each of those can contribute to heat vulnerability. This is things like income or age, where people live, how well they can speak English, for example, health conditions. And we had to think about how each of those factors can influence people's exposure to heat, their sensitivity to heat, and then also their ability to respond to heat. And yeah, not surprisingly, it was people experiencing disadvantage often have lots of compounding different impacts from extreme heat that I think we'll get onto a bit later on. We did this report through analysing research, and we also spoke a lot with the sector. That included a broad survey and a consultation as well. And then also part of the report as well was we had 21 recommendations about how to reduce heat vulnerability in Victoria. And I think the main ones really come down to housing, which I think has been building my interest more and more in energy efficiency. Yeah, I think the feedback from the sector is often that they would really love for clients to be able to stay safe in their own homes rather than having to risk heat illness if they stay inside, or having to go out and about to shopping centres or libraries that can close early, or they might be asked to leave. So yeah, feedback from the sector is that it would be the ideal situation is people being able to keep safe in their own home. So that's some of the policy research that VCOS has done about extreme heat. As I mentioned, we also do some advocacy and campaigns around some of these recommendations. So that includes some advocacy for the state election in Victoria, which is in a couple of days on Saturday. And then as well as that, we also do some capacity building in the sector. For example, in a couple of weeks, we're holding a heatwave forum in Melbourne where we're got an in-person event with a lot of community organisations and government and local councils just to share tips about preparing for the summer ahead. Because often community organisations, their budgets are so stretched delivering core services that it can be really difficult thinking far ahead to periods of extreme heat. So yeah, we're hoping that can help the sector have a think about how they themselves can build resilience, and then also ideas about how to help community members prepare as well. So yeah, extreme heat has been a really big focus of my work, looking at climate equity at VCOS. But yeah, really looking forward to the rest of the discussion today.
Thank you, Ben. That was fantastic. I'm really glad to hear that you're becoming an energy efficiency enthusiast. That's great. Also really happy to have VCOS here, have you hear from VCOS on this webinar, because I feel like that kind of vulnerable community aspect to all of these energy efficiency issues isn't always one that we get at the EEC, mostly working with kind of the business side of things. So thank you for joining us.
No, thank you.
So I will ask Kelly and Wendy to join us again, and we'll start getting into some questions. I'll just remind everyone in the audience, if you do have a question for our speakers, just drop them in the Q&A and we will get to them as soon as we can. So I'll start off with some questions targeted to each of our speakers, but of course, anyone else welcome to jump in and answer or speak to those questions as well. So I'll go back to Wendy first. So Wendy, we're talking about resilience specifically in terms of heat events, of course, but you've noted that there's a distinction between extreme heat events and extended heat and just general warming. So can you speak to this distinction and the implications of each for resilient cooling? And also, as a kind of second part to this question, how can we define and respond to heat hazards at various levels of society?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Julianne. I think when I started this work, one of the first things that struck me was a graph that I saw from the International Panel on Climate Change that showed on the x-axis temperature and on the y-axis the frequency, and a typical bell curve. And as the average temperature rises, that whole curve moves to the right. So there are two implications. One is that we will have more extreme heat. So instead of a heat wave being 35 or 36 in Brisbane, it might be 38, 39. But just as significantly, we have a greater period of time at hot temperatures. So instead of, so for Brisbane having, let's say 10% of the year between 30 and 34, we might actually have 40% of the year at that higher temperature. So both of those things are things that need consideration when we're tackling the heat event, both the heat waves, but also extended periods of time. And I'll give a few examples of that soon. The second thing that struck me was that generally speaking, we're not treating the heat hazard in the same way as we treat the hazards of fire, flood, storm, cyclones, etc. So there are 7 characteristics of natural hazards that can be applied to heat hazards. The first is how predictable is the heat hazard. So is the heat regular or irregular? Have we experienced such an extensive time or such hot temperatures before? Where is the hazard originating? Is the overheating threat inside the building or outside the building? So we actually do have some policies in Australia about heat hazards for sport outside, but we don't have an indoor heat hazard warning system yet, for example. Then there's what's the spatial distribution of the high temperatures? So is it just a particular region like Western Sydney, for example, or is it a whole of a state, or is it the whole of the eastern seaboard of Australia, for example? They have different implications regarding, for example, whether the electricity network can support the air conditioning that we're relying on. If Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria all had a heat wave or an extended hot period all at the same time, we wouldn't all be able to run our air cons. Then there's the timing, or what's called the temporal distribution of the heat wave. So a heat wave that occurs, for example, at the end of winter or early spring has a completely different impact on people than a heat wave that occurs in the middle of summer, because our bodies tend to adapt slowly over the year to the seasonal variations. But then also a heat event that happens during the Christmas holidays is completely different to one that happens when school or offices are fully occupied, for example. So just understanding the timing of heat waves or extended periods of hot weather, but also the speed and duration of the hazard. So we've seen with the flooding in New South Wales, for example, at the moment, the speed of some of the flooding has taken people by surprise. The speed of a heat event can also take people by surprise. And then the scale of the population that's impacted. So is it just the people in Western Sydney, or is it, if it's further afield, the scale of a disaster, and whether it's called an emergency or a crisis or a disaster or a catastrophe, actually elicits different responses from different emergency services and different funding support and different responses from insurers, for example, how many people are affected. And then lastly, there's a potential for the multiple or concurrent threats, so such as heat waves following another natural hazard. So for example, in Queensland in February 2015, the Rockhampton Gladstone area experienced Cyclone Marsha, which resulted in a loss of power and was immediately followed by days where the maximum temperatures were 5 or 6 degrees above average. So you already have a loss of power and a loss of some building functionality when the heat wave strikes. Similar thing I would expect now with all the people who have been displaced by the floods. If we have an extended hot summer or a heat wave in New South Wales and southeast Queensland, for example, and these people are being housed in tents, in caravans, in dongas, what are we going to do to make sure that they stay safe? At the same time, another really important concept that I learned was, again, from an IPCC report that was explaining the difference between coping and adapting, and that those two words actually elicit different responses. So an example, I guess, is our current heatwave response mechanisms that most jurisdictions have that are focused on people coping with an existing heat wave by saying, go to a shopping centre, go to the movies, or drink more water, or don't do as much strenuous outdoor exercise, that sort of thing. And that's based on a presumption that the hazard is short-term and that it's temporary. And we have heat wave indices, etc., but we don't really yet have any long-term mechanisms or plans for dealing with changes to much more broader changes that climate change will impact. So, for example, I live in the Gold Coast. and it's expected that we will have a 10-fold increase in the number of heat waves that we experience within this century. So from about 4 a year, and they last typically 4 or 5 days, we can expect up to 45 heat waves. Mount Isa, which is in our northwest of the state, can expect heat waves of 29 days duration, and 2/3 of the year where the temperature will be above 35 degrees. So not necessarily a heat wave, but 2/3 of the year above 35. Or Mackay in our central north coast, they're expecting heat days that could last 72 days. Now, that's not a temporary thing, and you can't tell people, just take it easy, go to the shopping centre, don't do outside stuff. So we actually need adaptation responses that might be increasing the energy efficiency requirements for our buildings. It will definitely require mandating minimum performance standards for rental properties. It might be things such as making changes to the nature of outdoor work, or the way that we construct buildings, or the people who work outside won't be able to work outside in a lot of our places. It might be requiring specific buildings like aged care centres to make sure that their emergency power systems that they have will actually power the air conditioners to keep those people healthy and alive. At the moment, they don't. They're for life support systems, but air conditioning is not considered a life support system. But I think in the future, it will need to be, at least for those people. So there's a few examples of systems and how we need to understand the nature of the hazard in a lot more detail, so that we could then plan for how we might be able to address it.
There's so much there. I mean, it's not just heat in one area, it's all of these different areas and different degrees of heat and different lengths. And then is it flooding? And then people are displaced, and how do they get adequately cooled? That's such a, it seems like almost a simple issue on the surface. I mean, not quite, but just heat seems like a reasonably simple issue. But then when you add all of these different variables into it, it really is a wicked issue, and there's a lot to that we need to understand, but we also need to respond so quickly. So yeah, thank you, Wendy. There's a lot to unpack from that one, but I'll go on to Kelly next. So Kelly, what sort of impacts are we seeing from these various heat threats at the regional level, particularly in Western Sydney, and how can we respond to these heat threats at that regional community level?
Yeah, no worries. And yeah, second, all the things that Wendy said there. I think when we've been looking at heat, I think initially we were looking particularly at urban heat, because that's obviously planning is an area that councils are looking at, but increasingly it is looking at the different causes of heat hazard and addressing those at different scales. So when we're talking about climate change in urban heat, we're looking at that longer term kind of just general warming. And in Western Sydney, talking with our health services and other people, they're really concerned about chronic disease, because we have really high chronic disease rates in Western Sydney. For example, diabetes is 3 times higher in our region than the eastern part of the city. And when you have, more days in 2020, we had 37 days over 35 degrees during the year. That's not really conducive to physical activity and getting that, that general quality of life, getting out, getting active outdoors. So what kind of chronic problems is that going to create? Obviously, cost of living is one, because if we are having, warmer weather for more of the year, we're looking at cooling. Western Sydney households already use 100% more energy for cooling than the eastern part of the city. And of course, that doesn't then compare to other parts of Australia. But I guess looking at that divide within our city, we're already using a lot more. What's that going to be looking like in future? And what does that mean for lower income households? And economic productivity as well. So the New South Wales government did a little bit of modelling last year, looking at the economic productivity impacts of heat, and estimated that there'd be between 700,000 and 2.7 million lost work days by 2060. And that's kind of at that economic scale. And then I guess that's just that general warming before we even get to those heat wave events. Obviously, huge impacts on the health system when we start looking at exacerbation of existing health conditions, particularly in a region where there are high levels of chronic disease, exacerbating heart disease, kidney disease, mental health issues, diabetes. There's social impacts. We've seen reports indicating increased levels of domestic violence and other types of mental health related conflict socially as well. And also, as Wendy's already mentioned, infrastructure is the big one during those extreme heat events. In a region like Western Sydney, we travel long distances to commute to work, to get home. What happens when we have outages and those public transport links are down? What happens when we have extended outages and we have limited access to mains water, to electronic payment systems, to, you know, lifts for some of the organisations we've been talking to in the community centre? How are you going to operate if you don't have access to, you know, lifts in buildings, to car parks, to everything that we rely on energy for? It has those cascading impacts across the city. And I guess while I'm talking in generalities around the types of impacts we're experiencing, it's important to note that while we anecdotally know that these impacts are really quite significant and are expected to grow in future, we aren't really measuring this. So particularly, you know, heat-related hospital admissions or causes of death, we're not measuring that systematically. So we really don't know this full scale of the issue because it's just not being measured. In terms of, I guess, what we're doing at a regional perspective, we've, I guess, been focused on the different drivers of that heat challenge in our region. So we are in a naturally hot climate in Western Sydney. Our councils have come together on a Western Sydney energy program to look at how they can reduce their emissions and improve their infrastructure, their HVAC systems, their energy efficiency, their street lighting. So I guess on that front, we're looking to do what we can there and also support local businesses and communities to do so as well. Then I guess on top of that climate impact, we've got Western Sydney's rapid growth. So yeah, we're seeing really unprecedented levels of development, and particularly greenfield development, which is driving an urban heat island effect, exacerbating that already hot climate and that already, you know, significant level of warming that's happened in our region. So to address that, we've really got together with our councils and other partners in state government and in the community sector to look at how we can design better communities. I know adaptation and retrofit is a really important thing as well. We work in that space, but it is going to have to be something that we're going to need to address at a regional scale in future. And I think addressing that regionally is really important because when you have a big metropolitan area like Greater Sydney, just addressing urban heat in one tiny pocket of the city really isn't going to cut it when we have such a huge big city and people are moving across the whole city and experiencing different levels of heat across the city. And I think lastly are those extreme heat events, which are, you know, regardless of what we do in terms of climate mitigation, in terms of urban heat mitigation, we're going to get those large scale meteorological events that are going to hit our region and cause real issues. And as Wendy mentioned, they're going to become more severe, more frequent, more longer in future. And at the moment, we really don't have anything other than telling people to keep cool, drink water, go to shopping centres. How are we adapting our communities? How are we preparing to provide outreach services to those really vulnerable members who can't access cooling due to cost or just because they don't have it available in their home? They may not have, you know, their own private transport. They may become isolated. I know in Western Sydney on one of those really hot days, if you go out in the streets of Parramatta or Penrith, it's deserted. There's no one in sight because people are sheltering and they're sitting in their homes. And what does that mean for the socially isolated people out there? They're not, you know, how come, I guess, there's a whole lot of social element to that as well in terms of how we respond to these emergencies. And some of our councils are looking at things like heat refuges. Some of them are looking at how we can integrate that into the existing built form to ensure there are cool spaces that aren't as reliant on air conditioning for people. But really, I guess, we've seen a huge benefit in all of our partners looking at that at the regional scale and learning from each other in terms of best practice and how we can move the region forward together.
Thanks, Kelly. Also, I mean, a lot to unpack there, of course. A few things that you said kind of stood out to me as far as measuring, I guess, the heat-related admittance to hospitals and also economic productivity losses from heat events, and a few different things. You know, we need to measure these things and the costs of them so we can balance them against what's the cost of not taking action in this area, because the cost of not taking action is actually going to be a lot bigger than the costs that we'll incur by the things that we need to do to mitigate and adapt. So we've got some questions coming through in the Q&A, but I do want to go to Ben next before we get to some of those questions, which do relate to some of the things we've been speaking about already. So Ben, what impacts are we seeing from these various heat threats at the household level? And what are some responses to these threats? And how do these responses change based on specific cohorts who might be particularly affected?
Yeah, sure. Just firstly, I think that data point that Kelly made jumped out at me as well. So I know on the advocacy side of things, it's something we've found really hard about heat waves. It's hard to find exact data about how many people are affected. I guess you look at bushfires and floods, for example, and when people pass away from those instances, there's like a name to and a face to them. So it's quite emotive, and it can, I think, really get political momentum moving on fixing those issues. But with heat, it's often sort of an estimate a couple of years down the track. So I've definitely found that's something that's made heatwave advocacy quite difficult. But in terms of impacts, probably the best case study I can think of is one of our members, Mallee Family Care in Mildura, which is one of the hottest places in Victoria. They interviewed public housing residents who don't have access to air conditioning. And yeah, some of the impacts and the flow-on impacts were, yeah, shocking. As we've talked about, there are health impacts like heat stroke and hospitalizations. But there was also so many families who couldn't get to sleep, so having to take their mattresses out to the garden or down to the river just to get some rest. There was also increased violence. Not only does heat make people more aggressive, but because people couldn't sleep, they were sort of just wandering the streets and drinking until the early hours of the morning because they couldn't get any rest. Even things like medication for some people don't work at extreme temperatures. And then with that lack of sleep and health impacts, there were kids missing out on school just because they couldn't concentrate and were getting sent home, or they were sick and didn't want to go. And then parents as well, missing out on work. And then there were even some residents who were given a portable air conditioner by community services, or maybe they saved up for one. But what they found was that after 1 month of using it, they saw the spike in the energy bills and they just couldn't afford to use it anymore. So if they do keep cool, they've then got to cut back on food and necessities, medicine and internet and things like that. So yeah, so those health impacts, then we see some real flow-on impacts from that as well. In terms of different cohorts, public housing is definitely a major priority of ours. We also think of three others: community housing, low-income homeowners, and then renters as well. So for us, we've seen research about those four being the least quality homes with the lowest energy efficiency. So with our advocacy, we targeted at those four cohorts generally. And as you mentioned, there's different responses needed for those. For example, for renters, minimum standards are probably the best way. If you give landlords subsidies, they generally won't take it up because it's not their home. Public housing is pretty easy one for state government. They own the property, so they can sort of just get in there. And then for community housing and low-income homeowners, we've been thinking grants might be the best way, just so that they can take that money and upgrade the homes themselves, whether that's insulation or efficient air conditioning. So yeah, there's a few different, I guess, prongs to improving the energy efficiency of existing homes, because new homes are already built to a really great standard, but it's those really old existing leaky ones that we're most concerned about.
Great, thank you, Ben. So I will go to some of the questions in the Q&A. So one of our speakers has kind of mentioned this previously. I think it might have been Kelly, or maybe it was Wendy as well, do heat refuges or emergency relief centers have a role in heat adaptation? Would either of you like to speak to that? I think it's a pretty big one that maybe everyone has touched on to a more or less extent.
I'll address that first, perhaps at an individual house level. So for some other hazards, like if you're in a cyclone place, having one room in the house where you know is more structurally, so typically it's the bathroom where you're advised to go to in the event of a cyclone, because that's the safest place. In some of the bushfire areas in Victoria, New South Wales, and the rebuild, they've encouraged having a bushfire retreat room or something within the house. You could do the same with housing. So rather than thinking you need to air condition a whole house, particularly if you're looking at the cohorts, for example, that Ben was talking about, having a cool retreat in one part of a house, really well insulated, that you could move your mattresses to, or and air condition something really efficiently in a confined space, rather than thinking we have to cool the whole house, is one strategy of a cool retreat within individual properties.
Great, thanks for that, Wendy. Kelly, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, so Blacktown City Council, which is one of our member councils, has trialled a heat refuge strategy over the last couple of years, and there's I've heard of a few different refuge strategies being trialled around Australia by local governments, and they're all kind of set up differently, but I guess there are a few challenges with those. Obviously, you're seeing then a whole bunch of high-risk people coming into one location, and then you have responsibility for those people. The transport to and from those cooling places can be a challenge, and I know Blacktown worked really closely with some of their community transport providers to make sure that was set up really well, and you were actually getting people who needed to be there. Opening hours are a challenge. What happens when it gets to 8 p.m. and whatever it is, the library or the community centre needs to close and people going back to these really hot houses. There's also, and this is, I guess, something that we'll be looking at and that Blacktown found that we'll be looking at a bit more, is that they found a lot of their public buildings, air conditioning systems are only really rated to function just over 40 degrees. So if we are looking at those really extreme temperatures and you get people to a place and the air conditioning is above the operational threshold of the air conditioning and you don't have backup power, what does that look like? So there are a lot of things you really need to think through to make that work well. That said, in the absence of homes that are keeping people safe, that is probably the best option for a lot of areas. Last year, we saw Penrith City Council really taking this on board as part of their planning controls. So they've included some DCP requirements to do exactly what Wendy mentioned in terms of having a dedicated space in a home, preferably on the southern side of the home, that can be closed down, that can act as the cool refuge. And they've looked at that for residential properties. They've also suggested that for workplaces, so the lunchroom potentially being the place that would be designated as the cool space that you could set up to function in that capacity, as well as areas in public buildings. So I think that's the first instance I've seen of that happening, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops over time. But obviously, when we're looking at planning controls, that's only going into new development. So there will be that, existing urban footprint that doesn't have access to those type of cool rooms. So yeah, I think emergency shelters, they have a lot of challenges, but I guess in some of those older areas, if that's the best we can do to help people, and so they don't have to feel like they have to be out spending money at the shopping centre to stay cool, that's probably one of the better options to at least consider or look at.
Yeah, for sure. And also, I guess it depends on, whether it's a dedicated facility built for this purpose or whether it's just some other type of commercial building. Coming at it from the nerdy energy efficiency side, if this building that people are going to isn't built to withstand that extra heat load, especially if there are a lot of extra people going to it, which probably isn't the case quite yet, but in the future, if this is kind of a trend that continues and we have let's say 30 extra people going to a smaller commercial building, the HVAC system probably isn't going to be able to withstand that extra heating load. So additional issues that are brought up there. Anything to add to that, Ben, before I go on to another question?
No, that was perfect. Yeah, like, as I mentioned, ideally people can stay safe in their home, but this will obviously take years and decades. So in the meantime, people will need those heat refuges. And yeah, Kelly raised all the issues that we've been hearing on the ground as well.
Awesome. All right, so I'll move to another question from the audience. This one's from Anna Mitchell. So in Sydney, social housing, there's an issue there around, there's basic maintenance, but then also improving the social housing through energy efficiency and resilience retrofits is a completely separate issue. So how do we get greater political support for that necessary investment? Are there any thoughts from any of you on that one?
I think one of the things relates back to what Kelly said, that we can't do a benefit cost analysis in essence if we don't have the data to show what's the cost of not doing it, how many people are losing work days, being admitted to hospital, having longer periods of illness, unable to work, etc. And I think because heat is generally not seen as dramatic as a bushfire or a flood, or a cyclone, you don't see damaged buildings, you don't see, generally don't see many bodies around. So it's not treated as seriously as some of the others, but it probably is actually costing the society a lot more than the other events, but it's hidden. So
Yeah.
unhiding it, I think, is the first step to getting traction.
Yeah, and that mention of data there gets me thinking about a Victorian homes. This was a focus on winter, but they upgraded low-income homes and then measured the energy bill savings, but also the health benefits. And what was amazing was that the health benefits, I think, outweighed the energy bill savings like 9 to 1. There was huge health savings. So if you're trying to convince state government or federal government about why to invest, there's a real return on investment there, which is a shame we have to talk about numbers when we're talking about heat waves that, actually kill people. But unfortunately, sometimes that to justify investment, we need to start talking about money. I also think too about the Mildura research I mentioned too. I think telling those very personal stories did bring change in that area. The state government committed to improving the energy efficiency of those public housing homes and installing air conditioning in all of them as well. So that project was, I think, undertaken about 4 or 5 years ago. And I think having those real personal stories and telling the real impacts of extreme heat were quite important, because, yeah, Wendy, as you mentioned, it's not as, the impacts aren't as obvious.
Yeah, I agree with everything Ben and Wendy have said, and I particularly, data. Yes, we need that data, but I do think there is, because heatwave is a silent killer and because it's often hidden behind closed doors. That communication of that experience is really important, and I know we've had a few conversations over the years with journalists and other people who, particularly around that really hot summer in 2020, when there were some areas that were measured really close to 50 degrees, asking, so do you go to the pool and what do you do in that kind of weather? And it's hard to communicate what that actually feels like, and that, communicating what that looks like for people, particularly people who can't access cooling. There is, I think, a great video that was developed by Link Wentworth, a community housing provider in Western Sydney. They worked in with social housing and community housing tenants to ask them about their tips for keeping cool. But there's also a video, a YouTube video that they've put up that's talks to one of the ladies that lives in there, and she talks about the impacts of heat on her life and her everyday lifestyle and in her home, and the challenges she has with retrofitting. So getting those stories out there, because when we do have heat waves, if you look at the media, we see pictures of people in Sydney on Bondi Beach, and that's not communicating the lived reality of a lot of people in our city. I guess you don't see pictures of people, I don't know, having fun when you're looking at bushfire and flood media coverage. It's a very different public conversation that's happening when these events occur.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. I guess it's a much more aesthetically pleasing visual than having someone who's really struggling in their home, but it is really hiding the issue, and bringing that more front and center is one of the ways that we can bring attention to this issue. So I've got another question, which is going back to basics a little bit, but I think it's worth talking about a little bit. So what types of upgrades can be undertaken for buildings so that they're resilient to extreme heat? So, we're talking about energy efficiency and resilience, but what does that actually mean? And I think this is a good opportunity, Wendy, if you want to talk about some of the cooling, some of the resilient cooling findings from the Annex, and, what actual strategies are we talking about? And I'll open it to Wendy, but all of you really.
Sure. So one of the things I first like to think about is that we seem to address heat a bit like a leaky boat. If you think of your house as a boat and it's got lots of holes in it and you're bailing water out. So we put air conditioners in buildings and we keep on trying to pump out all this unwanted heat, but we're not plugging up the holes to stop the heat from getting in the first place. So you wouldn't go out to Sydney Harbour or Moreton Bay or Phillip Bay in a boat that's got lots of holes in it and give everybody a bucket to keep on bailing out the water. You would plug up the holes to make sure it's seaworthy. So generally we're not making our homes heat worthy. So a good level of shading, good level of insulation, the right colours or materials that reflect the solar heat as opposed to absorb it. It is possible to produce homes that let in very little of the heat. And we've tried that in our own home, that during the southeast Queensland summer, our internal temperatures can be 10 degrees cooler than outside with no air conditioning, just because of the way that the building's been built. And part of the reason why I think we're not doing that is that we're not measuring, even though we have energy efficiency codes, we're not actually measuring what the performance of the building is in terms of its heat. So the Annex 80 has been looking at some indicators for resilience. So one of those indicators that we've been looking at is called the indoor overheating degree. So it's for each building being able to count what's the difference between the indoor temperature and what the comfort threshold temperature would be for the occupants of that building. So for example, in Darwin, acclimatised Darwinites are generally quite happy around 30 or 31 degrees if they have a ceiling fan. For Brisbaneites, it's probably closer to 27, 28. For Melbourneites, it might be 24. So depending on what sort of climate you're in. So it's a measure of understanding the difference between what is the actual temperature inside and what's the temperature threshold for your comfort and safety. Another is exceedance hours, which is how many hours of the year does that room actually exceed that comfort threshold then. So we're currently putting both of those terms together in a project with the Northern Territory Government and CSIRO to actually test a comfort rating for Darwin houses that we're using degree hours of discomfort, which is sort of similar to overheating degrees, and how many hours of the year and by how much, how many degrees Celsius do bedrooms and living rooms overheat, for example. So we're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of Darwin housing in meeting internal thermal comfort conditions relative to that climate in the absence of air conditioning, as a potential rating in addition to the energy rating of a house. So the energy rating tells you how much, in essence, how much air conditioning will you have to use to pump in or pump out heat. A comfort rating is saying, what is it without that pumping? How many hours will your house be, above 30 degrees or above 35 degrees? What percentage of the year? The other interesting term, one that I really like, that we've discussed in the annex is the term passive survivability, which is it's a measure of the ability of a building to maintain that safe comfort threshold in the absence of active cooling like air conditioning, which is generally powered by the grid. So that particular term is being used by the US Green Building Council, so similar to our Green Star ratings, as a potential credit for buildings. And I quite like that term, passive survivability, because it communicates the manner in which cooling is provided. So it's passive, so through the use of good design, and the purpose of providing the cooling, survivability of the occupant. So another term that's sort of essentially the same thing is thermal autonomy, but I think that's a bit too technical. I think passive survivability evokes a stronger emotional response to what is it we're actually trying to achieve.
Yeah, and just on that, I hadn't heard passive survivability, but I really like it too. Often I'll say thermal comfort instead, and it doesn't quite get across the gravity, I guess. It feels like just a luxury for someone to be comfortable, but survivability is really, yeah, what we're talking about. I think too, being able to measure a home's performance without cooling is important. As we've mentioned a few times in this webinar, yeah, a lot of people can't afford air conditioning or don't have it. So, and there's also so many power outages that can occur during heat waves as well. So yeah, for a home to be able to keep cool without relying on spending money on air conditioning, yeah, is really important.
So we're finding here in Australia and also in California, for example, during heat waves, often the power companies are having to turn off or switch off power because of the possibility of the transmission lines or distribution lines contributing to fires, for example. So increasingly, we have to consider not relying on grid electricity for some of the time. Therefore, what will we do? And that's where, you know, things like your cool retreats or something might have limited effect, or might have to consider the possibility of having their own emergency, you know, power systems or solar panels and batteries or something to be able to provide some level of thermal comfort in a really good building. But you need to start with a really good building in the first instance.
Yeah, and I think agreeing with all of that, we've recently completed a research report looking at the performance of currently compliant homes, so apartments and freestanding homes without power, and how they'd perform. We've used the 2017 heatwave that was in Western Sydney, and also, yeah, how does that performance track if they don't have access to air conditioning? Because we know that that's the reality a lot of people are living with. Even if they've got access, they might not be using it. And we know that if everything falls apart when there's a power outage, that's not really resilience to extreme heat, is it? So, and realistically, you know, a lot of those homes were tracking with the external temperature and had difficulties expelling that heat overnight. So we had higher overnight temperatures, which we know are one of the key drivers of poorer health outcomes as well. So definitely passive survivability, as Wendy mentioned, that's one of our key pushes as well, because if we are, I guess, when we're looking at resilience and extreme heat and disasters, we're looking at those vulnerable people, and those are the people who aren't relying on air conditioning necessarily. And even if they are, if there's an outage and everything gets cut off, what are we going to do then? I also wanted to add, you know, broadly improving the building envelope as opposed to relying on air conditioning also has broader benefits, because obviously when we're all running our air conditioning and pumping that waste heat into the environment, we're also building that urban heat island effect, which has, you know, a cycle of increasing that heat. So by improving that, you know, the thermal envelope over relying on air conditioning, we have those multiple benefits of reducing emissions, reducing urban heat, and also making us more resilient to extreme events.
It's certainly a vicious cycle. You know, if we have these really inefficient housing in heat events, we need to use more cooling if you can afford it. And then that cooling is contributing to climate change, which is making things hotter, and it just compounds. So Again, yeah, a huge issue with lots of different facets. I would just like to remind everyone that if you have a comment, feel free to put it in the chat. You can chat as much as you like in there. There are some comments in the Q&A, so just making that comment. I wanted to actually go back to you, Kelly, to talk a little bit more about the Cool Suburbs tool, which you mentioned briefly at the beginning. So I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about that tool and how it aims to contribute to reducing heat hazards.
Yeah, no problem. And I will preface that by saying I am not the technical expert that developed the tool. So any technical questions, I'm happy to take on notice and get back to you. But broadly, and as I mentioned, we've been working with councils to look at how we can embed all of the science and all of the things we know about urban heat and energy efficiency and thermal comfort and heat resilience into actual practical planning controls and design guidelines, really specific ones that can actually be implemented on the ground, because it is a new area to planning, particularly in New South Wales. I'm not as familiar with other states across Australia, but it's not something that we've traditionally done that well. There's been a lot of, in New South Wales, a lot of, high level guidance around the need to address urban heat islands and the need to become more resilient to heat waves, but actually translating that into practice has been quite challenging. So the Cool Suburbs tool is basically a rating tool that measures heat resilience of a development. It uses a range of credits, and it can be used at the precinct, lot, street, or suburb, different scales. And there's different credits that apply to different scales, because obviously if you're looking at a precinct, we want to see, use of water bodies and parks and orientation of streets to try and promote that cooling effect. If you're looking at the lot scale, there's only so much you can do with a singular home, and that might be, cool materials, tree canopy, permeable surfaces, and use of water. So basically, the tool was developed with the assistance of a science panel, and that included representatives from Western Sydney University, Monash University, University of Melbourne, the Water Sensitive Cities Institute, and probably a few others that I've forgotten off the top of my head. But I guess during the development, even those scientists with all of their expertise, and I think as Wendy's alluded to, there's a lot in there and it's quite a complex issue, and translating all of that knowledge into something really simple and practical that can be applied across the board is quite challenging. So I think often when we talk about this issue, there's often questions around why aren't developers doing better? Why aren't councils doing things better? Why aren't state governments doing things better? The answer is there needs to be that we do know what we need to do, but actually nutting that out into practical advice is quite challenging. So ultimately, yeah, the Cool Suburbs tool aims to do that. It's available for free for anyone who would like to have a look on coolsuburbs.com.au, and it's basically an Excel spreadsheet where you input details of your development, and then there's a series of credits with really clear guidance on how you meet each of those credits, including percentages for canopy cover or permeability and that type of thing. I will note that at the moment it is calibrated for the Western Sydney climate particularly, but we will be looking shortly to expand that to New South Wales, and if that goes well, it might be broader, who knows. And there's also on that website, there's a science rationale document that actually takes you through each of the credits and why those particular credits were developed in the way they were. So I guess if you're going through and thinking why, that doesn't seem necessary, there is actually an explanation with referencing there, just to, I guess, give people that assurance that it's not just random numbers we're pulling out of our head. We are, looking at how this can be used. So it is a voluntary tool. And compared to some of the other work we've done with the planning system, it is looking at best practice and it is pushing the boundaries quite a bit. So I guess if you are looking at it, it does fall within that best practice kind of what we ultimately like to see happening. And we're hoping that obviously that will increase people's awareness of actually what would a cool suburb look like? What are we actually aiming for here, and what would be required? And then we can look at, costing, what that would look like. And hopefully if we have that other data, we can start looking at, okay, what costs are we avoiding by investing that extra money into those cooler, better designed developments?
Hey, thank Thanks, Kelly. I mean, I think even without the caveat, you really got a lot of the detail in there. So that was a really great explanation. I wanted to go to Ben next, just to ask about, so Wendy spoke a little bit about the resilience indicators and Kelly talked about the cool suburbs tool. So what do you think are the implications for these different tools and measurements for building occupants, specifically vulnerable cohorts? And do these measures that Kelly and Wendy have spoken about intersect with any of the strategies for preventing heat-related harm that were identified in the Feeling the Heat report?
Yeah, absolutely. Like if Kelly could expand that tool to all of Victoria, that would be, yeah, that'd be excellent. It sounds really great. Yeah, just on the cool suburbs tool first, as part of the heat report, we were looking at where people live and how that impacted their heat vulnerability. So realizing it's not just the home, but also their environment and the suburb they live in. And what we found is that people experiencing disadvantage, as defined by CEFA and ABS, were more likely to live in hotter areas. So we looked at the urban heat island effect and plotted that against disadvantage, and there was actually a strong correlation there. So yeah, it feels almost perverse that the people who have the least resources to cope with heat are living in the hottest areas. So I think anything to cool down suburbs at that broader level would be fantastic. Those, just for an example, I think City of Brimbank in Melbourne's west, that's the second most disadvantaged in Greater Melbourne, but it's the hottest. So it's just that really strong overlap between the two, whether it's because there's more concrete or less parks in those areas. So I think having some really best practice there that local governments can do with support from state government and federal government would be, yeah, extremely useful. And in terms of the KPIs, I think having that data and measuring home performance is really important. I think, at least in Victoria, it feels like often things can be a little bit ad hoc, and I'm never quite sure of what the state of all of the housing is in Victoria. So I think being able to measure homes, it then means we can start setting targets. We can see where we're at and then think about where we want to be in 5 years and then 10 years time, and then sort of target initiatives accordingly. So yeah, I think any sort of data to measure home performance is really important, especially really practical ones like Wendy's, which are really looking at how people can survive in their homes during extreme heat, which would be so important to vulnerable cohorts. So yeah, definitely, I've got a lot of Googling and reading to do after this myself.
I feel like we all do. Did anyone else want to say anything else about the kind of measurement and tool issue before I move on to some more audience questions?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind adding something in that. I think there are two things that we're not currently doing that we could do. One relates to most councils already do a fair bit of GIS mapping of their local areas. They, map the streets, the water, the parks, etc., etc. One thing we tried in Townsville was we actually mapped the energy rating of all the homes in a couple of their suburbs as well. So you could see on the council maps where are all the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-star homes, for example. So and all that information is available in councils because the councils are the ones that receive all the housing approvals. So when you actually map the energy rating and ideally map the passive survivability rating of each house, you can overlay that then with your demographics and with your geography regarding where are the hotspots in your city, so that when you do have an extended period of hot weather, it can help in your emergency response. Which suburbs are the ones that we most likely need to send our social services to check on people. Which places might we have to evacuate, but it can also help local governments and organisations plan their rebuilding programs in terms of, which houses do we tackle first? Let's tackle all the ones under 5 stars, for example, as a first instance. The second bit where I think the data is not being used is in mandatory disclosure. So you get more information when you buy an iPhone now than what you do when you buy a house or when you rent a house. And I think the energy performance in particular of a property needs to be disclosed to all buyers and renters at the point of at the point of sale or contract, so that people have, I know we tend to buy, where's the school and shop or local place we want to go to, but within that, being able to compare different properties and know a bit more in advance what it is you're getting into would also help.
Absolutely, Wendy. I will say that I moved into my current apartment after viewing a few different ones because it was a newer build and had double glazing. And I went to another apartment, which I liked a lot better for other reasons, but the single glazing and just the build of the whole thing, I could feel myself being cold in winter. So I said, okay, I'm just going to make the smart choice here and move into the one that's going to be obviously a lot warmer. So I'm really thankful that I had that choice. But yeah, it's, I guess, the curse of being attuned to these issues, the curses and the benefits. So I'll go to another audience question, which is from Paul. So this is kind of going, I guess, a bit back to basics again, although, if these issues aren't something that you're thinking about on a daily basis, like all of us are, might not be something that you are really aware of. So the question is that, why do landlords decline upgrade subsidies? Is this because there are other considerations like maintenance? And a really interesting point also that he raised is, what about tenants not being able to pay rent on time if they have to pay electricity bills that are really high? So Ben, you'd mentioned that kind of split incentive issues for landlords. Do you want to talk about that issue, I guess, generally, and also how it relates to heat stress and resilience?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, there's been some research on the reasons why landlords upgrade or don't upgrade their homes, but yeah, split incentive is definitely one of them, where they're not living in the home, so they might not experience the benefit, and then they might not have enough confidence that it will boost the price of the home when it's up for rent again, that it will be worth the investment. Especially when we think in Australia, where property investment is that key part where they're investing it for financial opportunities. For an example, in Victoria, there are subsidies to landlords for efficient air conditioners and for solar panels as well, but the uptake in the renter stream is always really small. Something that Solar Victoria did find is that there's higher uptake when there's no property manager involved. So that could be the landlord and the tenant having a close relationship, and the landlord being more invested in the tenant's well-being because they know them personally. And sometimes property managers might not pass on requests, or can be a bit of a blockage that way. There's also a bit of a power dynamic that goes on between tenants and landlords as well. Like, tenants might not feel comfortable asking for things that are seen as a luxury. Like, I guess as a personal example, I'm a renter but haven't asked for solar panels. We've got a great landlord, I think, but at one point we want to get a second dog. Maybe you might have seen my greyhound Harry behind me, and it almost feels like you're using up that capital and that goodwill with the landlord by asking for something. So yeah, when you're on good terms with your landlord, you don't want to rock the boat. So yeah, there are a few reasons there, but I think, as Wendy mentioned, minimum standards are the things that we advocate for. Seeing the provision of a rental property as a service that you're delivering, and you're getting money from as well. So making sure it's up to standard, rather than hoping that landlords have got the tenants' well-being in mind.
It's interesting you said before about tenants not wanting to ask for something that's considered a luxury. And I think we have to stop seeing thermal comfort, good thermal conditions is not a luxury. It's a life safety, it's a wellness, health and well-being thing. And those specific goals are now included in the National Construction Code requirements. So it's not just energy efficiency anymore. It is indoor environment quality, wellness, resilience, etc. So we need to empower tenants to demand good conditions. So maybe one of the things organisations like VCOS can do is actually give tenants indoor thermometers to gather the data to present to their landlords about how bad their conditions are.
Yeah, I should say there's a great organization, Better Renting, that did that last summer and last winter. So they were putting thermometers in homes and measuring how hot and how cold they got. And yeah, the results were shocking. In terms of an individual basis, yeah, that's a great point. That would be such a good way to show why an upgrade's needed. And I think there's a health organization in Melbourne that's about to do that in public housing high rises as well. And yeah, the tenants there talk about how the homes get so much hotter than outside. So it'll be good having that actual like empirical data to take to state government. But yeah, that's a really good point, using data for individual advocacy.
Yeah, it's a bit of naming and shaming, sort of, in a sense, you know, the same as you do if you know, your doors if you don't have security, or if the steps are falling down, or if there's a leaky roof, or things like that. The only way to show the heat stuff is to actually have your temperature data.
I had a particularly hot day in an old share house of mine, which was absolutely horrible. I had about 15 minutes of Twitter fame on that house, just in how cold it was in the winter and hot in summer. But I was running a webinar much like this in the background, and the temperature was 33 degrees, and I was sitting next to a window with the shading on it, but it was still so hot. And I just thought it was so ironic that it was, you know, doing my energy efficiency work, but also having to deal with this, maybe not extreme to Queensland standards, but for Melbourne, and just being inside in general. It's just really, we shouldn't have to accept these standards. So I guess we've only got 3 minutes left. I think we kind of only have time for maybe one more question or just closing comments. I think I might just go to Kelly to see if you had anything to add to that kind of landlord-tenant discussion, or if there's any final comments you want to make, yeah, before we close out.
Yeah, I guess nothing, super new to add to that. But I think even, you know, you were talking about older dwellings, but even for new dwellings, you know, when people are building to rent, it's not the type of home where you're going to put in the most luxurious fixtures and fittings and the highest quality insulation and double glazed windows. Like, that's not why people are kind of building that home. And I suppose when we are looking at that type of thing, is as much, you know, data and you know, community discussion and debate is important. At some point we just have to ask ourselves, you know, what human conditions are we willing to accept as our basic minimum standard? How, you know, how low is the floor? How low are we willing to go in terms of what people are actually having to live with?
Thanks, Kelly. Ben and Wendy, any final thoughts on everything that we've covered, which has been a lot?
I think the resilience and the heat, just we've been focusing a lot on the people. So, but the engineers tend to think of, you know, do I have a really efficient air conditioning system? But we need to, it's the people and the buildings and the cooling technologies and the energy infrastructure that all have to work collectively on that. So that's, you know, so that's your building regulations, it's your social workers and your health workers, and it's your builders, your designers, your construction industry, your engineers. It's everybody needs to work on this solution. We can't just put it back to the end user, and we can't just put it to the local government. It requires all levels of government and all parts of society that contribute to the built environment to solve the issue and work collaboratively together for the health of everybody.
Absolutely. And I think even though, you know, just an hour and a half kind of talking about this issue, it's pretty simple, but enabling people to hear what people like you have to say is a really good way to kind of share that knowledge and facilitate the collaboration at least a little bit. And Ben, any final thoughts from you as well?
No, nothing from me. I've just enjoyed the discussion. I can't believe 90 minutes is up already talking about energy efficiency. Maybe I'm an energy efficiency nerd now as well.
Yeah.
But no, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me along. Yeah, it was great.
Well, I think we'll wrap up there, everybody. We're right on 3:30 now. So thank you to everyone who has joined in and asked questions. The speakers, thank you so much for joining us. Wendy, Ben, and Kelly, you've made my job very, very easy. So thanks for that. And thanks to everyone for coming along. Again, we'll send out a recording next week, and enjoy the rest of your day. And for any government representatives that will be joining us for the government and policymaker session. We will see you in the other meeting in just a minute. Thanks, everyone.
Right, thanks.
Right, thanks.
Thanks.